My name is Claire Sears. I'm 34 years old, and I hold a certificate of clinical competence in speech-language pathology from the American Speech-Language Hearing Association, which means I have spent the last 9 years of my professional life teaching people to find their voice. The irony of that is not lost on me. I say it because I want you to understand something about who I am before I tell you what I did. Speech therapy is a precision discipline. It is not about volume. It is not about talking louder or talking more. It is about the architecture of communication, the specific, technical work of identifying where a system has broken down and rebuilding it with patience and evidence, and the kind of methodical attention that does not announce itself. Because the work itself does not require an audience. I had been applying that discipline to my family's company for 14 months before anyone at Sears Capital Group knew I was doing it. I submitted the file at midnight on New Year's Eve, but I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the party first. The Sears Capital Group annual New Year's Eve celebration was held, as it had been for 11 consecutive years, in the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, a space that my father Gerald had selected in the company's 3rd year of operation. Because, as he told my mother Diane at the time, the ballroom communicated the right things about where Sears Capital was going. That was the year the company had crossed $40 million in managed assets. It now managed $340 million. The ballroom had not changed. My father believed in the power of consistent symbols. There were 200 guests, clients, partners, board members, the senior leadership team, and the specific category of social acquaintances that accumulates around successful men in their early 60s, people who are not quite friends and not quite colleagues, but who appear reliably at the events where appearing is the point. The room was lit with the warm, amber certainty of a space that has been designed to make everyone inside it feel that they are exactly where important things happen. I arrived with Nathan at 8:30. Nathan is my husband. 38, quiet, the kind of man who understands instinctively that the most useful thing he can do in most situations is be present without requiring management. He had worn the dark gray suit I liked, and he had not asked me, in the car on the way over, how I was feeling. Because he knew how I was feeling, had known for 14 months how I was feeling, and understood that asking would not change anything about the evening, and would only require me to spend energy I needed for other things. He handed me a glass of sparkling water at the bar and said, "Whenever you're ready." I said, "I know." My father was holding court near the center of the room. Gerald Sears, at 63, is a man who has spent 4 decades constructing an image of himself so consistently, and with such focused attention that I think, genuinely, he has stopped being able to distinguish between the image and the person underneath it. He is charming in the specific way of men who have learned that charm is a tool, deployed precisely, calibrated to the audience, genuine enough to be convincing and controlled enough to be strategic. He was wearing the navy suit he wore to significant occasions. He was laughing at something a board member had said. His hand was on the board member's shoulder. In the particular way he touched people when he wanted them to feel chosen. He had not looked at me since I walked in. This was not unusual. I had been standing in rooms with my father for 34 years, and the mathematics of his attention had been consistent for most of them. Colton received approximately 70% of whatever was available. My mother received 20%. And the remaining 10% was distributed among the various professional obligations and social performances that required his acknowledgement. I received my share of the 10%. Colton was across the room near the bar. My brother is 30 years old, and he has the specific, comfortable confidence of someone who has never been required to earn the rooms he walks into. He is not unintelligent. I want to be fair about this. He is not a fool. He is simply a person whose capabilities have never been accurately tested, because the environment around him has always been adjusted to ensure he does not fail, the way you adjust the height of a high jump bar, so that a particular athlete always clears it without understanding that the bar has been lowered. He was talking to Marcus Webb, the company's chief of staff. Marcus was nodding with the particular, careful attentiveness of a man who has been in corporate environments long enough to understand that agreeing with the future CEO of the company you work for is a survival skill, regardless of whether the agreement is genuine. I watched Colton talk. I had been watching Colton talk in professional settings for 3 years, since my father had brought him into Sears Capital as Vice President of Development at 27, a title that had been created specifically for him, with a compensation package that the company's existing VP-level employees had not been told about and would not have received quietly if they had been. I had watched him in client meetings and board presentations and the internal strategy sessions that my father ran every quarter, and I had developed, over 3 years of watching, a precise and documented understanding of the gap between Colton's performed competence and his actual operational capability. That gap was the foundation of what I had built over the previous 14 months. If you have ever watched someone receive credit for a system they didn't build and couldn't explain, in your family, in your workplace, in any room where the wrong person was holding the microphone, drop a comment, because what I am describing is not bitterness. It is the specific, clarifying frustration of a person with a technical mind, watching a technical system being misrepresented by someone who does not understand it well enough to know what they are misrepresenting. I should tell you how I came to know about the fraud. I am a speech therapist. I do not work at Sears Capital Group. I have never worked at Sears Capital Group. My father made it clear, in the year after I graduated with my master's degree, that the company was being built for Colton, and that my role in the family's professional legacy would be to support that narrative from a comfortable distance. He did not say this directly. My father rarely says anything directly that he can communicate through arrangement and omission. He said it by offering me a position in the company's administrative support division, a role 3 levels below my qualifications, and expressing genuine surprise when I declined. I built my own career. I have a private practice with 11 clients, a supervisory role at a pediatric rehabilitation center, and a publication in the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing research that took 3 years to complete, and that my father has never read. I came to know about the fraud because of Thanksgiving, 2 years ago, at the family Thanksgiving dinner, held at my parents' house, catered by the same company they had used for 15 years, attended by the same rotating cast of relatives and family friends, who appeared every November with the reliable predictability of a recurring calendar event. I was sitting at the far end of the table when I heard my father say something to my Uncle Richard that he did not intend me to hear. He said, "The Q3 numbers needed some smoothing. Colton handled it." Uncle Richard said, "How much smoothing?" My father said, very quietly, "Enough." Then he looked up and saw me looking at him. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned back to Uncle Richard and said something about the wine. I filed that exchange in the specific, careful way that I file everything. Not dramatically, not with an immediate plan, but with the methodical attention of a person who has learned that the most important information is often the information that was not intended for you, and that the correct response to receiving it is patience. I spent the next 3 weeks thinking about the word smoothing. In financial reporting, smoothing is a term of art. It refers to the practice of managing earnings across reporting periods to reduce volatility, presenting a more consistent performance picture to investors and stakeholders than the underlying numbers would support. In its mild forms, it operates in ethical gray areas. In its more aggressive forms, it crosses into territory that the Securities and Exchange Commission has specific regulations about. I am a speech therapist, but I grew up in the house of Gerald Sears. I had been listening to financial conversations at dinner tables since I was 9 years old. I had a working understanding of investment management terminology that most people outside the industry did not have, and I had, 3 years prior, completed a continuing education course in forensic communication. The analysis of language patterns is in high-stakes professional contexts that had given me a framework for identifying when the words someone chose were doing more work than the words themselves suggested. Enough, that was the word. Not minor, not routine, not standard. Enough. I spent 14 months building the file. I want to be precise about what that means, because precision matters to me, and because I think imprecision about what I actually did would misrepresent both the difficulty and the legitimacy of it. I did not hack anything. I did not steal anything. I did not access any system or document that was not accessible to me through legal means. And there were more of those than my father would have been comfortable knowing. As a family member of the company's founder, I had been included over the years in vitreous communications that most outsiders would not have received holiday reports. Annual summary letters that Gerald sent to close family. The occasional forwarded document from my mother, who had a habit of sharing things she found interesting without fully reading them first. I had a decade of these communications saved in an email folder I had never deleted. I also had public records. SEC filings are public. Quarterly reports are public. The company's registered investment advisor disclosures are public. Regulatory correspondence, when it results in public action, is public. And I had a lawyer. Claire Huang had been my college roommate's older sister, now a securities attorney, in her early 40s, sharp and methodical, in the way of people who have spent 20 years in a field that punishes imprecision. I had called her 14 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon from my car in the parking lot of the rehabilitation center and said, "I think my father's company may be misrepresenting performance data to investors. I have some documents. I need to know if what I'm seeing is what I think it is." She had said, "Send me what you have." 3 days later, she called me back and said, "You're seeing what you think you are. The question is how much more there is and whether you want to find out." I said, "I want to find out." 14 months. Speech therapy teaches you something that most people do not fully appreciate until they have spent years doing it. Change is slow, real, structural change, the kind that lasts, the kind that actually rebuilds something, rather than temporarily compensating for a broken component. Takes time and precision, and the willingness to work at a pace that does not feel like progress while you are inside it. I applied that understanding to the 14 months. I did not rush. I did not confront. I did not hint or signal, or allow my behavior at family events to change in any way that would have suggested to my father, or my mother, or Colton that the equilibrium of our family's dynamics was shifting. I attended Sunday dinners. I asked Colton appropriate questions about the company at appropriate moments. I was warm to my father in the specific, calibrated way I had been warm to him since I was approximately 16 years old, and understood that warmth was a performance the family system required and that performing it cost me less than not performing it. I went home from those dinners and worked on the file. By October, I had a 47-page document, organized by category, cross-referenced against public filings, annotated with Claire's legal analysis, and my own forensics communication. Notes about the specific language patterns in the communications that indicated deliberate rather than inadvertent misrepresentation. Claire had reviewed it 4 times. She had consulted with a former SEC enforcement attorney who had reviewed it once under attorney-client privilege and described it as, in his assessment, more than sufficient. We had decided on New Year's Eve, not arbitrarily, strategically. Gerald had announced, in November, that the New Year's Eve party would include a formal succession announcement. Colton would be publicly named as the company's incoming CEO, effective January 1st. The announcement had been framed to the board as a planned transition. To the family, it had been framed as inevitable. To me, it had been framed as nothing, because I had not been consulted, informed, or acknowledged in the planning of a succession that would transfer the company my father had built, and that I had watched from a careful distance, being used to deceive the investors who had trusted it, to a 30-year-old who could not have explained its compliance obligations to a regulator under moderate questioning. The timing was not revenge. It was accuracy. At 9:15 p.m., my father found me near the east side of the ballroom. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. "The practiced, proprietary touch of a man who is performing warmth for a room," he said. "Claire, you look well," I said. "Thank you, Dad." "So do you," he said. "Big night," I said. "I know." He searched my face for a moment with the specific attention of a man who has survived 63 years by reading rooms and reading people, and who had, I think, never fully trusted that he had read me correctly. He had always been slightly uncertain about me in a way he was not uncertain about Colton, because Colton was legible, predictable, organized around the axis of his father's approval, in a way that made him easy to understand, and therefore easy to manage. I had stopped organizing myself around my father's approval at 22, and he had never fully recalibrated for what I was organizing myself around instead. He said, "I'm glad you're here." I said, "I wouldn't have missed it." He held my gaze for one more second, then he was absorbed back into the room. A client requiring his attention, a hand extended, the smooth professional pivot of a man in his element. I watched him go. My phone was in my bag. The file was queued. Claire had confirmed the submission portal was active. Nathan was 4 feet to my left, holding his sparkling water, watching me with the quiet, steady attention of a man who had spent 14 months understanding exactly what this evening was. It was 9:17 p.m. 2 hours and 43 minutes until midnight. I picked up my sparkling water. I waited. 14 months is a long time to keep a secret from people you see at Sunday dinner. I want to be precise about what that requires, not emotionally. Not in the dramatic sense of someone carrying a terrible burden through candlelit family gatherings while string music plays in the background. I mean practically, functionally. The specific, daily discipline of a person who has decided that the most important thing she can do is remain exactly as she has always appeared, while doing something entirely different underneath the surface. Speech therapy trains you for this, not intentionally. The curriculum does not include a module on maintaining behavioral consistency, while conducting a parallel investigation into your family's financial practices. But the discipline of the work does something to the way you process and present information. You learn to separate the internal from the external. You learn that what a person shows and what a person is doing are often operating on completely different tracks, and that the gap between those tracks is where the real work happens. I had been working in that gap for 14 months. The first thing I did in the week after I called Claire was build an inventory, not of wrongdoing, not yet, of information. Every document, communication, and publicly available filing I had access to, organized chronologically and categorized by source. The family emails my mother had forwarded over the years. The annual summary letters my father sent to close family, written in the warm, confident prose of a man summarizing his own success for an audience he trusted. The SEC filings I pulled from the EGR database, Sears Capital's Form ADV, the Registered Investment Advisor disclosure, that detailed the company's fee structures, investment strategies, and compliance policies. 3 years of quarterly performance reports that had been included in the family communications as attachments. I am not a forensic accountant, but I am a person who analyzes language for a living. I identify the gap between what a communication system is supposed to do and what it is actually doing. I listen for the word that doesn't fit the phrase, that is doing more work than its surface meaning, the pattern that repeats in contexts where it should not appear. I read every document in my inventory 3 times, the first time for content, the second time for language, the third time for what was not there. What was not there, in 3 years of quarterly performance reports, was variance. In investment management, variance is expected. Markets move. Asset classes perform differently across quarters. A legitimately managed portfolio of $340 million in diverse assets should, across 12 consecutive quarters, show a performance pattern that reflects the actual movement of the underlying markets. Some quarters stronger, some weaker. The specific uneven rhythm of real financial performance. The Sears Capital quarterly reports showed something different. They showed consistency so smooth, it had its own texture. Quarter after quarter, the reported returns clustered within a band so narrow that the probability of it occurring through legitimate investment performance. Given the known volatility of the asset classes, the company reported holding was, as the former SEC enforcement attorney Claire consulted would later confirm, statistically implausible. Not impossible. Implausible, there is a difference. Impossible is easy to dismiss. Implausible requires explanation. If you have ever looked at a set of numbers and felt, in the specific technical part of your brain that processes patterns, that something was wrong before you could articulate what, drop a comment, because that feeling is not intuition. That feeling is competence recognizing a discrepancy that it has not yet finished naming. I brought the performance reports to Claire in January. She spread them across her conference table. 12 quarterly reports, printed, arranged in chronological order, and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Claire does not perform her thinking. She does it quietly and completely, and then speaks when she has finished. Which is one of the things I have always respected about her. She said, "The smoothing your father mentioned. This is what it looks like on paper," I said. "How bad is it?" she said. "Depends on what's underneath. The reports alone are suggestive. To establish a case, you need to show the gap between reported performance and actual underlying performance. That means getting access to the actual portfolio data," I said. "I don't have access to the portfolio data," she said. "Not yet. The portfolio data came from Marcus Webb, not directly. I want to be clear about this because the distinction matters. Marcus did not give me anything. Marcus did not know he was giving me anything. Marcus Webb, the company's chief of staff, had been with Sears Capital for 11 years, and he had the specific institutional knowledge of someone who's been inside a system part of its architecture, long enough to become part of its architecture. He knew where everything was. He had built many of the internal processes that organized how the company's information flowed. He had also, in November of the first year of my investigation, sent my father an email that my father had forwarded to my mother with the subject line, "FYI." Marcus flagged this, and the body of the forward containing only the original email unedited. My mother had forwarded it to me 2 days later with the subject line, "Re. FWD. FYI." Marcus flagged this in a message that said, "Claire, do you know anything about this? Your father seems stressed." She had not read it carefully enough to understand what it contained. I had the email was a compliance flag. Marcus, in his role as chief of staff, had flagged a discrepancy between a Q2 portfolio position report and the corresponding client statement for the same period. The numbers did not match. The discrepancy was not large, $340, 00 on a position worth approximately $12 million. But it was consistent with the direction of the smoothing. The client statement showed higher performance than the internal position report. Marcus's email was careful and professional and entirely without accusation. He was flagging a discrepancy for review. He was doing his job. My father's response, forwarded at the bottom of the chain, said, "Marcus, handled. Not an issue going forward." GS 3 words of instruction from a CEO to a chief of staff. Not an issue going forward. I sent the email chain to Claire. The same night my mother forwarded it to me. Claire called me the following morning. She said, "This is your pivot document." I want to tell you about the 9 months that followed because I think the work of those 9 months is the part of this story that gets lost in the telling of it. The part that gets replaced, in shorter versions, with a summary. She built a case. That makes it sound simple and deliberate and clean, in a way that the actual experience was not. It was not clean. It was Sunday dinners, where I watched my father describe Colton's contributions to the company's growth with the specific, practiced warmth of a man who has told a story so many times. It has replaced his memory of the actual events. It was Christmas at my parents' house, where my mother served the same food she always served, and my father made the same toast he always made. To family, to the future, to what we are building together. And I sat across the table from Colton and thought about the compliance flag, and the pivot document, and the 47 pages that were accumulating in a folder on my encrypted hard drive, and said nothing. It was the Tuesday in April when Colton called me. He called from what sounded like a restaurant. Background noise, the clink of glasses, the ambient hum of a lunch that was probably being expensed. He said, "Claire, Dad wants to know if you're coming to the Q1 family briefing." The family briefing was a Sears Capital tradition. A quarterly meeting, where my father presented the company's performance summary to immediate family, framed as transparency and functioning as performance. I had attended for 3 years. I said, "I'll be there." He said, "Great, should be a good one." Q1 numbers came in strong. I said, "That's good to hear." He said, "Yeah, listen, are you doing okay? You seem, I don't know, quieter lately." I looked at the wall of my office. On the desk in front of me were 3 highlighted pages from a forensic accounting textbook Claire had recommended and a printed copy of the SEC's whistleblower program guidelines, annotated in my handwriting. I said, "I'm fine, Colton. Just busy," he said. "Okay, see you at the briefing." I put the phone down. I picked up the annotated guidelines. By June, the file had grown to 31 pages. Claire and I met every 3 weeks at her office. A conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, glass-walled, with a view of the city that I never looked at, because I was always looking at documents. She would review whatever I had added since the last meeting. I would ask questions. She would answer them with the specific, calibrated precision of someone who understood that every word in a legal context carries weight, and that imprecise language creates vulnerability. She had, by June, brought in the former SEC enforcement attorney. His name was David Park, late 50s, retired from the enforcement division after 22 years, now in private practice doing exactly the kind of consulting Claire had engaged him for. He reviewed the file in a single session, 4 hours, the 3 of us in the conference room, the document spread across the table. David reading, with the focused silence of a man who had spent 2 decades looking at documents exactly like these. At the end of 4 hours, he said, "The pattern is clear. The pivot document establishes knowledge. The performance data establishes the method. What you need to complete this is evidence of investor harm. Documentation that actual clients received statements reflecting performance that the underlying portfolio did not support." I said, "How do I get that without accessing client records? I don't have authorization for." He said, "You don't. But the SEC does. What you're building is not a complete case. It's a referral. You give them enough to open an investigation. They have subpoena authority. They get the rest." I said, "How much is enough?" He looked at the 31 pages on the table. He said, "You're already there. Another few months of documentation and this becomes very difficult to dismiss. If you have ever done work that nobody could see, for a purpose that nobody knew about, in a direction that had no guarantee of arriving anywhere, drop a comment. Because 14 months of that kind of work requires a specific relationship with uncertainty that most people have not developed. You cannot need the outcome to validate the process. You have to trust that the process is correct and let the outcome be whatever it is. I trusted the process. Nathan trusted me. On the nights when I came home from Claire's office with the specific, compressed exhaustion of someone who has been doing precise work for 4 hours and needs to stop being precise for a while. Nathan made dinner. He did not ask for updates unless I offered them. He did not require me to process out loud what I was processing internally. He simply made dinner and sat across from me, and was present in the specific, undemanding way that genuine support operates. Not by asking what you need, but by providing the environment in which you can figure it out yourself. I had told him everything in January of the first year. Not because I needed his permission. I did not need his permission. But because I was not willing to conduct something of this magnitude inside a marriage, without the person I was married to knowing the shape of it. He had listened. He had asked 2 questions. Then he had said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Just be here." He said, "Done." October. The file was 47 pages. Claire scheduled a final review with David. We spent 3 hours going through it, section by section, tightening the language, confirming the cross-references, identifying any gap that a competent defense attorney could use to create reasonable doubt about the pattern we were establishing. David found 2 places where the documentation was inferential rather than direct. We addressed both. At the end of the session, David said, "This is ready." Claire said, "The question is when." I said, "New Year's Eve." Both of them looked at me. I told them about the succession announcement, about Colton being named CEO at midnight, about the 200 guests, and the grand ballroom, and the champagne, and the specific public performance of a legacy being transferred to the person my father had always intended to receive it. Claire said, "Submitting during the announcement creates a timing record that will be very difficult for them to separate from the event." "It will look deliberate," I said. "It is deliberate," David said. "The SEC whistleblower portal accepts submissions at any hour. Midnight is a valid timestamp," I said. "I know." Claire looked at the 47 pages, she said. "Then we spend the next 6 weeks making sure there is nothing in here that doesn't belong. We spent the next 6 weeks making sure. The night before New Year's Eve, I sat at my desk at home for 2 hours. Nathan was in the other room. The apartment was quiet. The encrypted folder was open on my screen. 47 pages, organized, cross-referenced, annotated, ready. I read it one final time, not looking for errors. Claire had found the errors. I was reading it the way I read a clinical report before I submit it, not for content, which I knew, but for the specific, confirming satisfaction of work that has been done correctly, the satisfaction of a system that has been assessed accurately and documented precisely, and is now ready to be submitted to the appropriate authority and allowed to do what accurate documentation does when it reaches the right hands. I closed the folder. I went to bed. In 14 hours, I would be standing in the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel in the dress Nathan had helped me choose, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my father give a company to my brother. And at midnight, I would take my phone out of my bag, and I would press send. There is a specific kind of waiting that is not passive. It does not look like waiting from the outside. It looks like standing in a ballroom with a glass of sparkling water, making appropriate conversation with people you have known for years, smiling at the right moments, asking the right questions about the right topics with the right level of interest. It looks from any external vantage point exactly like a woman attending her father's company party on New Year's Eve. From the inside, it feels like the final approach to a runway you have been navigating toward for 14 months. Everything calculated. Everything confirmed. The only remaining variable, time. It was 10:47 p.m. Nathan was beside me near the east windows when Marcus Webb found us. Marcus had the specific, slightly compressed energy of a man who has been managing something difficult for longer than he has been able to discuss it with anyone. I had been watching him across the room for the past hour. Watching him, the way I watch a client's communication pattern before I begin a formal assessment, looking for the places where the surface behavior and the underlying state were not fully aligned. Marcus Webb was a man doing a professional performance over a personal reality that the performance was not entirely containing. He said, "Claire, good to see you," I said. "Marcus, how are things?" he said. "Busy. End of year always is." He paused in the specific way of someone who has something else to say and is deciding whether this is the moment to say it. "I wanted to ask you something. Privately, if that's okay," Nathan said. "I'll find us another round," and moved toward the bar with the undemonstrative tact that I had married him for. Marcus waited until Nathan was out of conversational range. Then he said quietly, "Have you noticed anything in the family communications about the company's performance reporting?" I looked at him. His jaw was slightly tight. His eyes were direct in the way of someone who has made a decision to ask a question. "They cannot unask," I said. "What makes you ask?" he said. "Because I flagged something 14 months ago and was told it was handled. And I have been watching the quarterly reports since then, and I do not believe it was handled. And I do not know what to do with that." I held his gaze. Marcus Webb had been inside Sears Capital for 11 years. He had built systems. He had maintained processes. He had sent a compliance flag to a CEO who had responded with 3 words and the implicit instruction to stop asking. And he had spent 14 months doing exactly what I had spent 14 months doing, watching, documenting, waiting, except that he had been doing it alone from inside the system, without a securities attorney and a 47-page file and a submission queued for midnight. I said, "Marcus, I need you to trust me about something." He looked at me. I said, "By tomorrow morning, the situation you are describing will be in the hands of people with the authority to address it properly. I need you to do nothing tonight. I need you to go back to the party and behave exactly as you have been behaving, and let the evening proceed." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "You already did something." I said, "I'm doing something." He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just had a hypothesis confirmed that he had been carrying alone for over a year. Something in his face settled, the specific, physical settling of a person who has been holding tension in anticipation of a resolution and has just received confirmation that the resolution is coming. He said, "Okay." He straightened his jacket. He went back to the party. If you have ever discovered that someone else in a broken system had seen exactly what you saw and had been waiting, alone, for someone to do something about it. Drop a comment. Because there is a specific, complicated feeling in that moment, not triumph. Something closer to grief. For the time, both of you spent carrying something separately that you could have carried together, if the circumstances had been different. It was 11:15 p.m. My father had moved to the small elevated platform at the north end of the ballroom. Not a stage exactly, more a slightly raised area that the hotel used for presentations, equipped with a microphone stand, and the ambient authority of a space, slightly elevated above the people around it. He was speaking with Helen Ostraki, the board member, whose name I recognized from 3 years of company communications, a woman in her early 50s, with the specific watchful quality of someone who has spent decades in governance roles and has developed an accurate sense of when a room's official narrative and its actual situation are not the same. Helen was listening to my father with the careful, neutral attention of someone gathering information before forming a conclusion. Colton was beside my father, standing with the slightly performative ease of someone who has been told, this is his moment, and is practicing inhabiting it. He had a glass of champagne. He was looking at the room. The way my father looked at rooms, with the proprietary assessment of ownership, but without the competence that my father's version of that look was built on. My father's version of that look had been built over 40 years. Colton's version had been installed 3 weeks ago, when Gerald told him what was happening at midnight. I watched him look at the room. I thought about the 47 pages. I thought about the Q2 compliance flag, and the 3-word response, and the 14 months of Sunday dinners and quarterly briefings and family Christmases that I had attended with the specific, disciplined composure of a person doing something important in the space between appearances. I thought about the word smoothing. At 11:30 my father found me. This time he was not performing for the room. He had separated himself from the cluster of guests near the platform and crossed the ballroom with the direct, purposeful movement of a man who has something specific to say and has chosen his moment for it. He stopped in front of me. He said, I want to talk to you before midnight, I said. Okay, he said, I know this has not been easy for you, the succession. I know you are capable. I have always known you were capable. He paused. I made decisions about the company's future based on what I thought was best for the family, for the legacy. Colton carries the name in a way that, I said. Dad. He stopped. I said, you don't need to explain the decision. I understand the decision. He looked at me for a moment, the specific, slightly uncertain look he had been giving me for 34 years. The look of a man who has never fully been able to read the daughter, who stopped organizing herself around his approval at 22. He said, I just want you to know that this doesn't diminish what you've built, your practice, your work. I'm proud of what you've done. I looked at my father. Gerald Sears at 63 in his navy suit. At the party he had been holding in this ballroom for 11 consecutive years. On the night, he was going to hand his company to his son, while the company's performance data existed in a relationship with the truth, that 47 pages of documented evidence, described with considerable precision, I said. Thank you, Dad. He put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, then he went back to the platform. My phone was in my bag. I had checked the submission portal at 10:30, a single, brief check, the way you check an instrument panel before a critical phase of a procedure. Active, accessible. The file attached, the form completed, the submit button, the only remaining action between 14 months of work, and the hands of the people authorized to act on it. Claire had confirmed at 9 p.m. via text. Everything ready on our end. Your call on timing. I'll be up. Nathan was beside me. He had returned from the bar 20 minutes ago, with 2 glasses of sparkling water, and had not said anything beyond handing me mine and resuming his position at my left. Present, steady, requiring nothing, at 11:45. My father tapped the microphone. The room gathered. 200 people oriented toward the platform with the collective, anticipatory attention of an audience that has been told something significant, is about to happen, and is now waiting for it to happen. Glasses were raised. Conversations concluded. The specific, ambient hum of a party in progress gave way to the specific, different hum of a group of people, preparing to witness something. My father said, "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight." 11 years. This room has seen a lot of New Year's Eves, and every one of them has been a reminder of what we are building together at Sears Capital. He spoke for 4 minutes. I have a clinical skill, developed over 9 years of assessment work, for listening to the structure of a communication rather than its content, for hearing the architecture of what is being said while the surface meaning moves past. My father's 4 minutes were structurally a performance of certainty. Every sentence built from a foundation of assumed legitimacy, the legitimacy of the company, the legitimacy of its performance, the legitimacy of the legacy he was about to transfer. The foundation was 47 pages of documented evidence away from being legitimate, he said. Sears Capital has always been about the future, about building something that outlasts any single person. Tonight, I want to make that future official. He gestured to Colton. Colton stepped forward. He smiled the smile of a man receiving something he had always expected to receive. My father said, "Effective January 1st, Colton Sears will assume the role of Chief Executive Officer of Sears Capital Group." The room responded applause. The sound of 200 people performing the celebration of a thing they had been assembled to celebrate. It was 11:58 p.m. I took my phone out of my bag. Nathan looked at me. I looked at the screen. The submission portal was open. I had kept the tab active since 10:30. The form was complete. The 47-page file was attached. The submit button was blue and specific and waiting. Colton was shaking hands with board members. My father was accepting congratulations with the warm, proprietary satisfaction of a man who has just completed a significant transfer of something he believed was his to transfer. Helen Ostracki, from her position near the left side of the platform, was watching the room with the careful, neutral attention she had been maintaining all evening. As I watched her, she looked at her own phone briefly. Then she looked up. Her eyes moved across the room and found mine. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away. I did not know, in that moment, what Helen Ostracki knew or suspected, or had been quietly gathering in her own right. I knew only that her look had the quality of someone who had just confirmed something they had been uncertain about. The countdown had started somewhere in the room. Guests with champagne glasses raised the collective, anticipatory energy of a group of people, marking the transition from one year to the next. 10. My father was laughing at something the board member beside him had said. 9. Colton had his arm around someone's shoulder, already performing the role he had just been handed. 8. Nathan was beside me, completely still, his sparkling water at his side, his eyes forward. 7. I looked at the submit button, 647 pages. 14 months. 1 compliance flag. 3 words from a CEO who had believed the matter was handled. 5. Claire was awake, somewhere in the city, waiting. 4. Marcus Webb was across the room. I could see him. He was not counting down. He was watching me. 3. My father caught my eye across the ballroom. 2. He smiled. The warm, proprietary smile of a man who believes the evening has concluded according to his design. 1. I pressed submit. The room exploded into celebration. Champagne opened. The sound of 200 people greeting a new year with the specific collective joy of a moment that has been building for hours and has finally arrived. Music, laughter, the ambient, joyful noise of a party at its peak. I stood in the middle of it. My phone showed a confirmation screen. Green. A reference number. A timestamp. 12:03 a.m. Nathan looked at the screen. He looked at me. He said nothing. I put the phone in my bag. I picked up my sparkling water. I looked across the ballroom at my father, who was embracing Colton, who was laughing, who was holding his champagne glass, up in the celebration of a transition that had just been submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. As the subject of a whistleblower complaint, supported by 47 pages of documented evidence. He did not know yet. Nobody in that room knew yet, except Nathan and Claire, somewhere in the city, watching her phone, and Marcus Webb, across the ballroom, who was looking at me with the expression of a man who has just watched someone do something he had spent 14 months hoping someone would do. And Helen Ostracki, who was looking at her phone with an expression I could not read from across the room, but which had, I noted, shifted from the careful neutrality she had maintained all evening into something slightly different. Something that looked, from a distance, like recognition. It was 12:11 a.m. when my father's phone rang. 11 minutes. That is how long it took. I have thought about those 11 minutes many times since that night. Not obsessively. Not with the circular, unresolved quality of thoughts that have not found their conclusion, but with the specific clinical interest of someone examining the gap between an action and its consequence. 11 minutes between the timestamp on my confirmation screen and the moment my father's phone rang. 11 minutes in which the party continued exactly as it had been continuing. The champagne, the music, the celebration of a transition that had just been legally complicated in ways none of the 200 people in that ballroom yet understood. 11 minutes of a world that did not know yet. Then my father's phone rang. I was watching him when it happened. He had moved back toward the platform, Colton beside him, both of them, receiving congratulations with the warm, proprietary ease of men who believe the evening has concluded according to their design. My father had his phone in his jacket pocket. I knew this, because I had watched him check it twice during the countdown. The habitual gesture of a man who is never fully disconnected from the communications infrastructure of his professional life. The call came at 12:11 a.m. He took the phone out. He looked at the screen. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in the visible, performative way of a man receiving shocking news in a movie. In the small, specific way of a man whose body has registered something significant before his mind has finished processing what it is. He excused himself from the conversation he was in. He stepped away from the platform. He answered the call. I watched his face across the ballroom for the 45 seconds of that call, watched it the way I watch a client's face during an assessment, looking for the micro expressions that tell the story. The surface presentation is not telling. His jaw tightened on the left side. His hand, holding the phone, went very still, in the specific way that hands go still when the person they belong to is applying significant conscious effort to maintaining composure under load. He said 3 words into the phone that I could not hear from across the room. Then he lowered the phone. He stood very still for a moment, then he looked up. And across 200 people, and the ambient noise of a New Year's Eve celebration, and the specific amber warmth of the Harrington Hotel Grand Ballroom, his eyes found mine. I have replayed that moment more times than I can accurately count. Not the submission, not the countdown, not the 11 minutes. That moment, the moment my father looked across the ballroom and found me, in the specific way that people find someone when they already know who they are looking for. His face, in that moment, did something I had not seen it do before. It understood. Not the contents of the 47 pages. He would not have the full picture of those for days. When the SEC's initial inquiry arrived, and Claire's documentation was formally entered into the regulatory process. But the shape of it, the architecture. The fact that the thing that had just happened had not happened to him. It had been done to him, deliberately, by someone who had been planning it for a long time, and that person was standing 30 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water, with the same composed expression she had been wearing all evening. He looked at me. I looked back. I did not look away. I did not perform anything. Not satisfaction, not apology, not the complicated grief of a daughter who has done something irrevocable to her family. I simply looked back at him with the direct, unguarded attention of someone who has finished the work and is no longer managing the gap between the surface and the interior. The gap was closed. The work was done. He was the first to look away. If you have ever had a moment where the person who underestimated you finally understood the full scope of what they had underestimated, drop a comment. Because I will tell you honestly, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like the specific, exhausted completion of something that should never have been necessary. The feeling is not satisfaction. It is a closer to the feeling, after a long clinical case reaches its resolution. The quiet, professional acknowledgement that the correct outcome has been achieved, complicated by everything the process cost. Colton noticed something was wrong at 12:18 a.m., not because he understood what had happened. Colton would not understand what had happened for several more hours. and his understanding, when it arrived, would be partial and defensively filtered and organized around a narrative of external attack rather than internal accountability. But he noticed that his father had gone still in a way that was inconsistent with the evening's energy, and that stillness had registered as a signal even to someone who was not, by training or temperament, a particularly careful reader of rooms. He crossed to my father, spoke to him quietly. My father said something brief. Colton's expression moved through the same sequence. My father's had. The initial confusion, the processing, the tightening, but faster and less controlled, because Colton had not spent 63 years building the composure infrastructure that Gerald Sears had constructed and maintained. His version of receiving significant bad news looked different from his father's. More visible, more immediate. He looked at my father. He said something. My father said something back. Colton looked around the room. Not for me specifically, not yet, because he did not yet know what my father knew. With this slightly unfocused scan of someone who has been told something disorienting and is trying to reorient in an environment that has not yet caught up with the information. Marcus Webb had moved. He was now positioned near the east side of the room, close enough to the exit corridor to leave quickly if the situation required it, far enough from the platform to be outside, the immediate blast radius of whatever was developing there. He was watching my father and Colton with the careful, contained attention of a man who had spent 14 months watching and was now watching the outcome of what he had watched. He caught my eye briefly. He gave me the smallest possible nod. Not congratulation, not relief. Just the clean, professional acknowledgement of someone who has witnessed a correct outcome. Helen Ostracki had moved to the edge of the platform. She was on her phone. Nathan said quietly, beside me. "We should probably find our coats," I said. "Give it a few more minutes," he said. Okay. The party did not collapse dramatically. I want to be accurate about this because I think the dramatic version, the sudden, visible disintegration of a celebration into chaos, is not what actually happened, and accuracy matters to me more than narrative convenience. What happened was quieter and more gradual than that, a disturbance at the center of a room that moved outward in slow concentric rings, as information and speculation traveled from person to person through the specific, efficient network of a gathering where most people knew each other. My father spoke briefly to two board members at 12:24 a.m. Both of them took out their phones. One of them left the ballroom. The other found Helen Ostracki. Colton had stopped shaking hands. He was standing near the platform with the slightly vacant expression of a man whose evening has been reorganized around information. He does not yet fully possess and is not sure how to perform in the absence of a clear script. At 12:31 a.m., my father crossed the ballroom. He walked directly to me, not with the warm, proprietary confidence of his earlier approach. The hand on the shoulder, the performed pride of a man summarizing his own success for his daughter. He walked with the compressed, deliberate movement of a man who has something specific to say, and has decided to say it, regardless of what the saying costs him. He stopped in front of me. Nathan was still beside me. He did not move. My father said, "It was you." I said, "Yes." He said, "The SEC." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, the noise of the party, diminished now, quieter. The ambient energy of a celebration that had lost its center moved around us without touching the specific contained space of this conversation. He said, "Why tonight?" I said, "Because tonight was when you were transferring authority over a company whose performance reporting does not accurately reflect the underlying portfolio data to a person who does not understand the company well enough to be accountable for what it has been doing. And because the people whose money is in that company deserve to have someone with regulatory authority reviewing that situation before the transfer was complete." He looked at me. His face, in that moment, was not the face of a man who was going to argue with what I had said. It was the face of a man who had known, on some level, in the way that people who build things on compromised foundations always know, somewhere below the level of conscious acknowledgement, that the foundation was compromised, and who was now standing in the moment when that knowledge had become public in a form that could not be managed back into private. He said, "I thought I could manage it." I said, "I know." he said. I thought Colton. I said, Colton cannot manage it. You know that. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at me. He said, what happens now? I said. The SEC will open a preliminary inquiry. Claire will be in contact with the company's legal counsel tomorrow morning. The board will need to convene an emergency session, and someone with full operational knowledge of the company's actual portfolio positions will need to be available to cooperate with the regulatory process, he said. And that person is you, I said. That person has always been me. You just didn't put my name on anything. 3 weeks later, the board convened. Helen Ostracki chaired the meeting. She had been, it emerged, conducting her own quiet assessment of the company's governance for the previous 8 months. Not an investigation in the formal sense, but the careful, watchful accumulation of a board member who has learned, over decades, to trust the signals that something in a system is not operating as it should. She had not had what I had, but she had been ready to act when something changed the equation. The board voted to appoint an interim CFO pending the completion of the SEC's preliminary inquiry and the implementation of a remediation plan. They appointed me, not unanimously. 4 votes in favor, 1 abstention, 1 against. Helen voted in favor. The abstention was a board member who had been a close associate of my father's for 20 years and who could not bring himself to vote against Gerald's family, but could not justify voting against the documented evidence either. The vote against was Colton, who had been invited to the meeting as Outgoing's CEO designate and whose authority to vote on the matter was legally questionable, but who cast it anyway with the specific, cornered energy of someone performing agency in a situation where their actual agency had been significantly reduced. My father did not attend the meeting. He had called me the night before. He said, I'm not going to fight this. I said, I know. He said, I want you to know that what I said at the party, about being proud of what you've built. That was true. It was true before tonight, and it is true now. I sat with that for a moment. I said, I know that too, Dad. He said, I made choices that I told myself were about the company and the family and the legacy. I think they were also about. I think I was afraid of what it meant if you were the right person for this, and I had spent 30 years not seeing it. I said, you saw it. You just couldn't act on what you saw. He was quiet. I said, that's not the same thing as not seeing it. He said, no, I suppose it isn't. We did not resolve anything in that phone call. Resolution is a slower process than a single conversation. And I am a person who understands that real, structural change takes time and cannot be rushed into coherence. What we did was begin. That was enough for that night. I drove home from the board meeting through a city that looked the way cities look in January. The specific, stripped-down clarity of a month that has removed the decorations and the celebrations, and left the actual structure of things visible without ornament. Nathan was home when I got there. He had made dinner. Nothing elaborate, the simple, practical dinner of a Tuesday evening in January, the kind of meal that does not require a special occasion, and does not announce itself, and is precisely what you need when you have spent the day in a boardroom, and the weeks before that in a legal process, and the 14 months before that in the specific, disciplined work of building something that nobody could see. I sat down. He sat across from me. He said, how did it go? I said, 4-1, 1 abstention. He said, interim CFO. I said, interim CFO. He looked at me for a moment with the specific, unperforming attention that I had married him for. The look of a person who sees you accurately and does not require you to be anything other than what you are. He said, how do you feel? I said, like someone who finished a very long clinical case and is ready to start the next one. He said, that's very you. I said, I know. We ate dinner. Outside, the January city continued its specific, stripped-down existence. The actual structure of things, visible without ornament, operating according to its own logic regardless of what had happened in a ballroom 3 weeks ago and a boardroom this afternoon, inside the apartment. The food was warm, and the work was done, and I was sitting across from the person who had made dinner on the nights when I came home from Claire's office with the compressed exhaustion of someone doing precise work for hours. I had not walked away from my family. I had walked away from the silence that had been required to maintain their version of it. Those are different things. and the distance between them. Like the distance between what a company reports and what its portfolio actually supports. Like the distance between who a family says deserves something and who the evidence shows has always been capable of it. Is exactly the kind of distance that a person with a precise mind and 14 months of documented evidence can close. Quietly, completely, and without raising her voice once.